Multiple barrels, spring-loaded blades, brass knuckle grips. That's not some steampunk fantasy. That's a real weapon that terrorized the Wild West, and it's been deliberately hidden from you for over a century. While history books fed you stories about honorable gunfighters and codes of the frontier, the real power belonged to outlaws carrying weapons so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that entire territories tried to ban them from existence. Sleeve guns that fired during handshakes, walking canes hiding rifle barrels, assassination devices disguised as everyday objects. What you're seeing is just one of 10 weapons that were too effective, too cruel, and too terrifying for public knowledge. Today, we're breaking that silence and exposing the mechanical nightmares that really ruled the Wild West. Prepare yourself. This isn't the romanticized frontier you learned about. This is the truth they never wanted you to discover. Number 10, the Apache Knuckle Duster. Let's start with one of the most ingenious and terrifying weapons ever carried by outlaws, the Apache Knuckle Duster. And before you ask, no, this wasn't made by Apache tribes. This weapon came from the criminal underworld of Paris, but it found its perfect home in the lawless territories of the American frontier. Picture this nightmare scenario. You're facing what looks like an unarmed opponent, and suddenly they reveal a weapon that's part revolver, part knife, and part brass knuckles, all rolled into one compact killing machine. The Apache Knuckle Duster was the ultimate close-quarters combat weapon. It featured a 6-shot pinfire revolver with no barrel. Yes, you heard that right, no barrel. Instead of accuracy, it relied on pure devastating power at point-blank range. But here's where it gets brutal. Attached to the frame was a 3-inch folding knife blade, sharp enough to slice through leather and flesh with ease. The third component was perhaps the most vicious, the brass knuckle grip. When you held this weapon, your fist became a devastating blunt instrument capable of crushing bone and cartilage. Outlaws loved this feature because even when the gun was empty and the knife was dull, they still had a brutal hand-to-hand weapon. The Apache was small enough to hide in a coat pocket, making it the perfect weapon for surprise attacks. Bank robbers would walk into establishments looking completely harmless, then reveal this nightmare device when the moment was right. The psychological impact was enormous. Victims never knew if they were about to be shot, stabbed, or beaten to death. But here's the catch. While the Apache was devastating at close range, it was practically useless beyond arm's length. The lack of a barrel meant accuracy was non-existent, and the knife, while sharp, was relatively short. Smart outlaws used it as a backup weapon, or for intimidation, knowing that just the sight of this bizarre contraption would make most people surrender immediately. What made this weapon truly brutal wasn't just its design, it was the mentality it represented. This was a weapon built for close, personal violence, designed by people who understood that sometimes the most effective tool was the one that looked like nothing special until it was too late. Number 9, the knife-pistol combination. Now, if you thought the Apache was brutal, wait until you hear about the knife-pistol combinations that terrorized the frontier. These weren't just weapons. They were engineering marvels designed specifically for killing at close range. Imagine facing an outlaw who pulls what looks like a large hunting knife, only to discover that the handle contains a single-shot pistol pointed directly at your chest. This was the reality of knife-pistol combinations, weapons that combined the reliability of a blade with the stopping power of a firearm. The most common design featured a substantial knife blade, usually 6 to 8 inches long, with a single-shot percussion cap pistol built into the handle. The trigger was typically a small button or lever positioned where your thumb would naturally rest while gripping the knife. This meant an outlaw could stab with the blade and fire the pistol almost simultaneously. But here's what made these weapons particularly brutal: the psychological warfare they enabled. An outlaw could approach a victim under the pretense of a simple knife fight, something that was common enough in the Old West. Then, just as the victim thought they understood the rules of engagement, the outlaw would fire a 22 or 32 caliber bullet at point-blank range. The craftsmanship on some of these weapons was extraordinary. German and Belgian gunsmiths created versions with folding triggers, safety mechanisms, and even decorative engravings. Some featured spring-loaded blades that could be deployed instantly, turning a seemingly innocent tool into a deadly weapon in seconds. Outlaws particularly favored these weapons because they solved a common problem: running out of ammunition. In the heat of a robbery or gunfight, when your revolver was empty, you still had a reliable knife that could end a confrontation. There was no reloading, no mechanical failure, just cold steel that would work every time. The most brutal aspect was their use in ambush situations. A lone traveler might be approached by someone offering to share a campfire, only to find themselves facing this dual-purpose weapon when their guard was down. The combination of surprise and overwhelming force made resistance nearly impossible, but these weapons had their limitations. The single-shot capability meant you had one chance with the firearm component, and the added weight of the pistol mechanism made the knife less balanced than a traditional blade. We contacted collectors across 3 countries and studied mechanical patents from the 1870s to decode how these surprise weapons actually worked. You now understand assassin-level technology that took us serious detective work to piece together. Subscribe. This kind of deep dive takes real commitment. Number 8, the sword cane. And speaking of weapons hidden in plain sight, let's talk about one of the most deceptive and brutal weapons in an outlaw's arsenal: the sword cane. This wasn't just a gentleman's accessory. It was a lightning-fast killing machine that could end a confrontation before anyone realized what was happening. Picture this scenario. An elegantly dressed stranger enters a saloon, leaning casually on what appears to be an ordinary walking cane. Then someone calls him a cheat at the poker table, and in one fluid motion, he draws a razor-sharp blade from what everyone thought was just a walking stick. The sword cane's brutality lay in its deception and speed. The typical design featured a steel blade, usually 18 to 24 inches long, concealed inside a hollow wooden or metal shaft. A simple twist or pull mechanism would release the blade, transforming a walking aid into a deadly weapon in seconds. What made sword canes particularly brutal was their reach advantage. While most men carried knives with blades under 6 inches, the sword cane gave its wielder nearly 2 feet of razor-sharp steel. An outlaw could strike before his opponent could even draw a conventional weapon. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine the shock of realizing that the distinguished gentleman you'd been underestimating was actually a skilled swordsman with a concealed weapon. This element of surprise gave outlaws enormous tactical advantages. But here's what made sword canes truly brutal. They were perfect for ambush tactics. An outlaw could walk right up to a victim, engage them in conversation, and strike when their guard was completely down. However, unlike pointing and shooting a revolver, wielding a blade required serious training and practice. Number 7, the Pepper Box Revolver. Now let's talk about a weapon that looks like something out of a steampunk nightmare, but was actually one of the most feared firearms in outlaw hands. The Pepper Box Revolver. This wasn't your typical 6-shooter. This was a multi-barreled monster designed to unleash hell at close range. Imagine facing down an outlaw who draws what looks like a small cannon with 6 barrels clustered together like a deadly flower. Each barrel was loaded and ready to fire, giving the wielder 6 shots of devastating firepower without the need to reload. In the split-second world of gunfights, this advantage often meant the difference between life and death. The Pepper Box Revolver solved a critical problem that plagued outlaws using single-shot weapons. What happened after you fired your 1 bullet? With a Pepper Box, you had 5 more chances to end the fight. Each barrel was individually loaded with powder, a lead ball, and a percussion cap, creating 6 separate weapons in one compact package. But here's what made the Pepper Box truly brutal in the hands of outlaws: its intimidation factor. When someone saw those multiple barrels pointing in their direction, they understood immediately that resistance was futile. Bank tellers, stagecoach drivers, and law enforcement officers often surrendered rather than face the overwhelming firepower of a Pepper Box at close range. The weapon's design was both ingenious and terrifying. With each pull of the trigger, the barrel cluster would rotate, bringing a fresh, loaded barrel into firing position. This mechanism allowed for rapid fire that was devastating in close quarters combat. An experienced outlaw could empty all 6 barrels in seconds, creating a wall of lead that few opponents could survive. Outlaws particularly favored Pepper Boxes for specific situations. During bank robberies, the weapon's ability to control multiple hostages simultaneously made it invaluable. A single outlaw with a Pepper Box could threaten an entire room full of people, knowing that even if someone tried to rush him, he had enough firepower to stop multiple attackers. The psychological warfare aspect was equally important. The Pepper Box's unusual appearance and obvious firepower advantage created an aura of invincibility around outlaws who carried them. Victims often described feeling helpless when faced with these weapons, understanding instinctively that they were outgunned and outmatched. But the Pepper Box had its brutal drawbacks too. The weapon was notoriously inaccurate beyond close range, and the multiple barrels made it heavy and unwieldy. More dangerously, there was always the risk of chain firing. If sparks from one barrel ignited the powder in adjacent barrels, the weapon could explode in the user's hand, causing horrific injuries. Despite these risks, smart outlaws understood that the Pepper Box's advantages far outweighed its limitations. For close-range robbery work and intimidation tactics, the Pepper Box was unmatched.
Number 6, the belly gun.
And if you think the Pepper Box was brutal, wait until you hear about the belly gun. A weapon so vicious and personal that its very name tells you everything you need to know about how it was used. This wasn't a weapon for gunfights at dawn or dramatic showdowns in the street. This was a weapon designed for killing people at touching distance.
Picture the most intimate and terrifying scenario possible. An outlaw pressed close against his victim, maybe in a crowded saloon or during a fake embrace, with a small, powerful pistol pressed directly against their body. That's the belly gun, a weapon designed specifically for point-blank assassination and robbery work, where silence and surprise were everything.
The typical belly gun was a small, snub-nosed revolver with virtually no barrel length, sometimes as short as 1 inch. This extreme design made the weapon incredibly easy to conceal, but devastating at close range. The lack of barrel length meant the muzzle flash and powder burn would be horrific for anyone on the receiving end, often causing severe burns in addition to the gunshot wound. What made belly guns particularly brutal was their intended use. These weren't weapons for fair fights or dramatic duels. They were assassination tools, designed for killing people who never saw it coming. An outlaw could approach a victim under the pretense of asking for directions, sharing a drink, or conducting business, then strike when their target was completely off guard. The psychological impact of belly guns went beyond their immediate victims. Word spread quickly in frontier towns about outlaws who used these weapons, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where people couldn't trust anyone who got too close. Belly guns were perfect for stagecoach robberies and crowded saloons where the weapon could eliminate witnesses without alerting anyone. But here's what made belly guns truly terrifying. They required a specific type of criminal to use effectively. When you encountered an outlaw with a belly gun, you were facing someone who was comfortable with the most personal and brutal form of violence imaginable. We just spent weeks digging through historical archives and museum collections to find these forgotten weapons that most historians overlook. You now have access to brutal outlaw secrets that took us months to uncover. Hit that subscribe button. This research doesn't happen by accident.
Number 5, the Blackjack Sap. And speaking of weapons that operated in silence, let's discuss two of the most underestimated and brutal tools in an outlaw's arsenal, the Blackjack and the Sap. These weren't glamorous weapons that made it into dime novels, but they were responsible for more unconscious victims and cracked skulls than almost any other outlaw weapon.
Picture this scenario. You're walking alone down a dark alley in a frontier town when a figure approaches from behind. Before you can turn around, something heavy and devastating strikes the base of your skull and consciousness fades instantly. That's the brutal efficiency of a blackjack or sap, weapons designed to incapacitate quickly and silently. The blackjack was typically a leather-wrapped lead weight attached to a flexible handle, often made from whalebone or spring steel. This design allowed the weapon to deliver devastating blunt force trauma while remaining completely silent. The flexible handle increased the impact force by creating a whipping action that could crack skulls or break bones with a single well-placed strike. Saps were similar but often smaller and more concealable, designed to fit in a pocket or be worn on a belt without detection. These weapons were usually filled with lead shot or sand, giving them enough weight to knock a person unconscious while remaining light enough for extended carry. What made these weapons particularly brutal was their intended use. Unlike knives or guns, which were designed to kill, blackjacks and saps were specifically engineered to incapacitate without necessarily causing death. This allowed outlaws to neutralize threats, silence witnesses, or subdue victims without the noise and attention that came with more dramatic weapons. But here's the truly sinister aspect. The line between unconsciousness and death with these weapons was razor thin. The same blow that could knock someone out for robbery could easily cause fatal brain trauma if applied with too much force. Outlaws particularly favored these weapons during bank robberies and in crowded saloons, where a quick strike could eliminate resistance without alerting anyone to what was happening. Number 4, the Springloaded Blade. Now, if you thought the weapons we've covered so far were brutal, wait until you hear about spring-loaded blades. Weapons that could transform an innocent-looking everyday object into a deadly surprise attack tool faster than the eye could follow. These weren't just weapons, they were mechanical marvels designed for the ultimate ambush. Imagine facing an outlaw who appears to be holding nothing more threatening than a walking stick, a book, or even a harmless piece of wood. Then, with a barely perceptible movement, a razor-sharp blade shoots out with such speed and force that resistance becomes impossible. That's the terrifying reality of spring-loaded blade weapons. The most common design featured a blade housed inside a hollow handle or casing, held in place by a powerful spring mechanism. A small trigger, button, or lever would release the spring, sending the blade shooting forward with enough force to penetrate clothing, flesh, and even bone. The speed of deployment was so fast that victims often didn't realize they'd been stabbed until they saw the blood. What made these weapons particularly brutal was their element of complete surprise. Unlike a traditional knife, which had to be drawn and positioned for attack, spring-loaded blades could strike from what appeared to be a completely non-threatening position. An outlaw could be engaged in normal conversation, even shaking hands with his victim, when he triggered the mechanism and delivered a fatal wound. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine the horror of realizing that what you thought was a friendly gesture or innocent interaction was actually a carefully planned attack. This level of deception created a paranoia among frontier communities that made normal social interactions fraught with tension and suspicion. But here's what made these weapons truly brutal. They required no skill to use effectively. Unlike swords or knives, which demanded training and practice, spring-loaded blades relied entirely on mechanical advantage and surprise. This meant that any outlaw could carry one and be confident of its effectiveness, regardless of their physical capabilities or fighting experience. Number 3, the rifle cane. And speaking of weapons disguised as walking aids, let's discuss one of the most ingenious and brutal firearms ever created, the rifle cane. This wasn't just a hidden weapon, it was a fully functional rifle, disguised so perfectly as an ordinary walking stick that victims never suspected they were staring down the barrel of a deadly firearm. Picture this terrifying scenario. An elderly gentleman approaches, leaning heavily on what appears to be an ornate walking cane. He asks for directions, engages in polite conversation, and seems completely harmless. Then, in one fluid motion, he aims his walking stick at you, and you realize you're facing the business end of a rifle barrel. By the time you understand what's happening, it's already too late. The rifle cane represented the pinnacle of concealed firearms technology in the Old West. These weapons featured a full-length rifle barrel hidden inside a hollow cane shaft, with the firing mechanism cleverly integrated into the handle. From the outside, they looked exactly like ordinary walking sticks, complete with decorative heads and appropriate weight distribution. What made rifle canes particularly brutal was their combination of power and deception. Unlike the small caliber weapons typically used for concealment, rifle canes could fire full-power rifle cartridges with deadly accuracy at considerable distances. This gave outlaws the ability to eliminate targets from ranges where the victims felt completely safe. The engineering involved was remarkable. The trigger mechanism was usually hidden in the handle, often disguised as a decorative element or functional component of the cane. Some designs featured the trigger built into the handle grip, while others used a twist mechanism that armed the weapon and prepared it for firing. Outlaws particularly valued rifle canes for assassination work and long-range intimidation. Unlike pistols, which required close proximity to be effective, a rifle cane could eliminate targets from across a street or through a window. But here's what made these weapons truly brutal. They were perfect for violations of social trust. Outlaws could exploit people's natural sympathy for the elderly or disabled, using their apparent infirmity to get close to victims who would never suspect danger. Number 2, the modified Bowie knife. Now let's talk about a weapon that became so legendary it was named after the man who popularized it. But the versions carried by outlaws were far more brutal than anything Jim Bowie ever imagined. We're talking about Bowie knife variations that turned a simple blade into a multifunctional killing machine. The traditional Bowie knife was already a formidable weapon. a large, fixed-blade knife with a distinctive clip point and sharp edge, designed for both utility and combat. But outlaws took this basic design and modified it into something far more sinister and deadly. Picture this. An outlaw draws what looks like a standard Bowie knife. But as he grips it, you notice additional features that turn your blood cold. Some versions featured brass knuckle guards integrated into the handle, transforming the knife into a dual-purpose weapon that could punch and stab simultaneously. Others had hidden compartments in the handle, containing poison, lockpicks, or even small amounts of gold for bribes. The most brutal variations featured serrated or saw-toothed edges along the spine of the blade. These weren't just for show. They were designed to create devastating wounds that were difficult to treat and slow to heal. Some outlaw Bowie knives featured weighted pommels that turned the handle into a devastating club, allowing the weapon to be used in reverse for bone-crushing blows. But here's what made these weapons particularly brutal in outlaw hands. They were designed for intimidation as much as killing. A large Bowie knife worn openly sent a clear message about the carrier's intentions and capabilities. Unlike concealed weapons, these blades were meant to be seen, to create fear and establish dominance before violence even began. Outlaws often customized their Bowie knives with personal touches that enhanced their brutal reputation. Some featured carved handles made from unusual materials like bone or antler, while others bore inscriptions that boasted of previous kills or threatened future victims. The reach advantage of a large Bowie knife was crucial in close combat situations. With blades often exceeding 10 inches in length, these weapons could strike before an opponent with a smaller knife could respond. The most brutal aspect was their silence. While gunshots attracted attention, a blade could kill quickly and quietly.
Number 1, the sleeve gun. And now, let's talk about perhaps the most insidious and brutal concealed weapon in any outlaw's arsenal, the sleeve gun. This wasn't just a hidden weapon, it was a mechanical marvel that could deliver death literally at arm's length, often during what appeared to be a friendly handshake or casual gesture.
Imagine the ultimate betrayal of trust. An outlaw extends his hand in greeting, and as you reach out to shake it, a small but deadly pistol slides from his sleeve into his palm. Before you can react, you're facing a loaded weapon at point-blank range, with your own hand trapped in what you thought was a gesture of friendship. The sleeve gun was typically a small single-shot pistol designed to be worn along the forearm, held in place by a spring-loaded mechanism or leather harness. A simple arm movement or muscle contraction would release the weapon, sending it sliding down into the wearer's hand in a fraction of a second. The entire process was so smooth and natural that observers often missed it completely. What made sleeve guns particularly brutal was their ultimate violation of social conventions. Handshakes, embraces, and other friendly gestures became potential death traps when facing an outlaw equipped with one of these devices. This weaponization of normal human interaction created a level of paranoia that poisoned social relationships in frontier communities. The mechanical design varied, but most sleeve guns featured a barrel length of 3 to 4 inches, chambered for small but effective calibers like 22 or 32. While these weren't the most powerful cartridges available, at touching distance, they were absolutely lethal. Outlaws found sleeve guns invaluable for specific criminal activities. During card games where hands were constantly moving and gesturing, a sleeve gun could be deployed without anyone noticing until it was too late. In business meetings or negotiations, the weapon allowed outlaws to maintain a facade of civility while holding the ultimate trump card.
But here's what made sleeve guns truly brutal. They required extensive planning and premeditation. Unlike weapons drawn in the heat of passion, sleeve guns had to be carefully positioned, armed, and prepared before any confrontation began. For outlaws who mastered their use, sleeve guns represented the perfect assassination tool. Complete concealment, instant deployment, and the ability to strike during moments when victims were completely off guard.
These brutal weapons reveal the dark truth about outlaw culture. They didn't just kill, they terrorized entire communities through psychological warfare. Which weapon shocked you most? Do you think these predators shaped the frontier more than famous gunfighters? Drop your thoughts below and subscribe for more hidden history.